This past Monday, the nation paid tribute to its war dead. It was Memorial Day, a day that too often nowadays is more well known for being the beginning of the unofficial beginning of the summer season. But World War II, and you're seeing scenes from World War II, 16 million Americans served there. They came back, each one of them with a story to tell, but there were some unfinished stories out there as well. Good Sunday morning, everybody. It's those unfinished stories and even untold stories that we're going to focus on today with Bill Beigel. Bill is, how would you describe you? It's too simple to describe you as a military historian.
Right. I think a better way to describe me as a researcher of World War II and Korean War casualty records.
That's the important part. It's the casualty records.
Right.
People come to you with unfinished, untold stories because they need, as you have described it, closure.
Right.
Give us an example of what kind of questions people will have.
Sure. I did a great project. Now it's probably 10 years ago. I was working with a woman whose father was a POW in World War II. He'd
prisoner of war.
Prisoner of war. Had been shot down over Hungary, and he had recently passed away. And she knew nothing about his time in the service or anything about him being a prisoner of war. And he refused to talk about it, like so many of these guys are. And anyway, I was able to find the report of the crash of his B-24 bomber. And the one part that always stands out in that story is that one of the other members of his crew was up in the nose of the aircraft. And that part of the aircraft is kind of a glass area. And this individual who was the bombardier was about to fall out of that part of the plane. It had been hit by anti-aircraft fire. So my client's father went over to try to grab the guy, and he was already slipping out head first, and he grabbed onto the guy's boot. And the forward progress of the plane caused the rest of him to go out of the plane, and so my client's father was left holding a boot and a sock of this guy that fell out of the plane at 20,000 feet. So that's an example.
Yeah, you need to know what that boot and that sock represented.
Right, and so she never knew anything about any of this until I found the report. And so it was a great feeling of satisfaction to me also.
And how did it affect her life?
She was much more proud of her father than she'd ever been before.
Of course, sure.
You know, she knew he was a war survivor, but didn't know anything else.
Wow. We're going to look at 4 individuals, all of whom served in the Navy during World War II.
Right.
They also had something else in common.
Right.
They all went to
UCLA.
And you graduated from there
Yes,
as
I
well.
did. A bachelor's degree and a master's degree from UCLA.
Any particular reason why you focused on UCLA for some of this work?
Well, the reason I focused on it was that I did have some feeling of attachment to my old school, even though it's been many years now. And I did some research on the internet and found that they did have a list of their students and faculty that had died during World War II. But there wasn't much else there. So I contacted the military science department that produced the list and said that as a volunteer project, I would be interested in finding out the stories of the about 200 names that they had. And typically people pay me to do my work, but I felt a connection to UCLA. And it turned out to be a great project. Not only did I find out information on these 200 names, but I found another 61 names that they didn't even have on their list.
So why don't we begin? There was, he's an Ensign? Patterson.
Yeah, Ensign Peterson.
Peterson.
Right. Peterson.
We've got a photograph of him. Tell us about him.
Well, Ensign Peterson was an out-of-towner. He was actually from Atlanta, and by some means he ended up going to UCLA, became a naval pilot, and in 1944 in the Pacific, he was returning from a raid, had been hit by anti-aircraft fire, and crashed on a little airstrip in the middle of the Pacific, killing him and the 2 men in his plane. And part of what was such a sad story about Peterson is that due to a few errors, it took a long time to get his remains brought back to Atlanta where his mother wanted them. She was a single mother. His father was not in the picture.
And how much was involved in getting to that point?
Well, it was a challenge because I didn't have a serial number for him, and so especially with a common last name like Peterson, if you don't have that serial number, you're not going to get any luck. And so I finally worked with the Naval Historical Research Center at the Washington Navy Yard, and they were able to get me some squadron records for him. And the great part about that was somewhere on the 5th page, it showed his service number. And that was the key to me getting the rest of his records. So I did. I worked with the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, and a few months later, there I had this giant stack of paper that was his military career.
Any other distinguishing events during that career?
Well, he was a UCLA student and had done well at UCLA. He was not a frat guy. A lot of the guys I researched were members of fraternities or the sports teams. So he was more of a typical kind of guy, which I liked. And he had a very solid naval career, but it ended the way that so many of these careers did, on an island in the middle of nowhere. I think the airstrip was called the Torquino airstrip, and you know, I'm sure now it's long since overgrown and forgotten.
Or developed.
Or developed.
Who knows?
Sure.
Who knows?
Sure.
And you mentioned that that his remains were returned.
Recovered, right.
That's somewhat unusual?
Yeah, especially for flyers of any kind. The odds were against the remains being returned, either because so many of these guys went down over the ocean, or they went down over the Himalayas. They went down over areas that you simply could never find the remains again. And in fact, of the 406,000 Americans who died in World War II, over 70,000 are yet to be recovered.
And probably never will be.
Probably never will, but if you watch and you research, every month or so you'll find a small plane was found somewhere in New Guinea, and they did some DNA testing and they were able to find a few of the guys, but yeah, most of them will never be found.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, you know, somebody ought to commission you to search for Amelia Earhart. Has that thought ever crossed your mind?
You know, she's been in the news recently, and I thought that they were very close to perhaps finding her. I mean, that would, of course, would be a great story.
And the same kind of scenario. You've got desert islands. And,
absolutely.
Yeah. So you have another
Sure.
GI.
Sure.
Although I'm not that sure that that's appropriate.
I guess you wouldn't really call them GIs,
yeah.
but I don't think any of these guys would mind at this point.
Yeah. So it's another ensign?
Which one are we talking about?
We're talking about not Freitas, but Brooks.
Oh, Brooks is a great story. Brooks, he was not part of the UCLA list, and the way that I even found him was looking at a 1939 UCLA yearbook. And what I did was I started and went through every photo of every male in that yearbook, and hundreds and hundreds. Then what I did was I matched it up with some casualty lists that the military produced in 1946. And as I was going through his fraternity photos, I found him, and son of a gun, there I found him on one of the naval lists as missing in action from World War II. And Brooks really comes across like a really good guy. He had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and I believe the Gold Star prior to his last mission. And what happened was he was flying a big PBY. These were big 4-engine Navy patrol bombers. And I read another guy saying it was like driving a bus. You know, all these guys wanted to be fighter jockeys and nobody wanted to be flying the PBY. Anyway, he was on a recon mission far behind enemy lines, Japanese lines over the Philippines. And they had the bad luck to encounter a couple Japanese fighter aircraft. And even though the PBY had a lot of armament on it, it's going to be very tough for a big, slow aircraft like that to fight these Japanese Zeros that are darting up and around him. And so what Brooks did was, once he realized that the aircraft was hit, and there were 3 guys from the crew, 3 or 4 guys that survived the crash, he told them, you guys got to get out of the plane. I'm going to try to keep it level so it's easier to bail out and it'll be easier to land. And he did all those things. He kept it flat, he kept it level, and in so doing, some of these guys did escape. He did not. It crashed into the water, and I believe the front end of the aircraft was torn off, and he was in the front, and that was how he lost his life.
We have more stories to tell, which we will do after we take a break. We'll be right back. For more information about the fascinating work that Bill Beigel does, the name of your company is?
Personalized World War II historical research.
There you are. And you can find this fascinating site that he has. It's WW2research.com. You don't need the www in front. It's just WW2research.com. And the phone number is
310-791-3949.
This is Midday Sunday. We're talking about, we're talking with Bill Beigel about the research that you do into the men and women who served primarily during World War II, but also Korea.
Right.
And what we've decided we're going to refer to as untold stories about their military careers.
Right.
And we've been focusing on one of your larger projects, which was UCLA.
Right.
There was a draft at this point. Were all these fellas drafted, do you know? Or
a lot of them
volunteers?
were drafted. A lot of them were ROTC. A lot of them were volunteers.
Reserve Officer Training Corps?
Correct. Yeah, there was a very extensive ROTC and Naval ROTC program at UCLA. You look at the photos from the yearbooks in the late 30s, early 40s, there's hundreds of guys that were part of that program.
And considering the patriotism during World War II, particularly at the beginning, these guys probably one way or another were eager to go.
I think they were very eager to go, and they went into many of these guys were officers, and because they were junior officers, the casualty rates among them were huge. These guys were second and first lieutenants in the Army, and they were the guys they called the 90-day wonders.
Exactly, yeah.
And they'd be in training camp in New Jersey, and 2 weeks later they'd be in a snowstorm in Luxembourg, under German shelling, and many of them lost their lives that way.
Yeah, but they were great heroes.
Absolutely.
Although when you mentioned 90-day wonders during my military career, certainly ran into a lot of those. Sometimes literally, because they were lost in more ways than one.
Right.
One of the people that you did, one of the UCLA graduates, well, they may not have been graduates.
They were not all graduates. I think Peterson was the only graduate.
Okay.
Oh, and Brooks. Peterson and Brooks both graduated.
Okay,
The others did not graduate.
So that brings us to Freitas.
Right.
His first name, I don't recall.
I believe it's William.
Yeah, okay. William Freitas.
Real interesting guy, and the way that I found out about him was I got a hold of a number of fraternity offices, the main offices that they have, and I got his fraternity to send me their newsletters from the mid to late 1940s, and I found 10 or 11 UCLA grads I didn't even have in their newsletter. And, Freitas really seems like a guy that I would have liked to have gotten to know. One of the things that was so interesting about him was when they sent back his personal effects, he had these books.
Oh, yeah.
And the one about the giant book of dog stories, I wondered, is that a book he had since he was a boy? Or was he just the guy that really liked dogs? And the other thing that was so heartbreaking about him is that his his wife and his mother had sent him a big Christmas package not long before he died.
Yeah.
And when it arrived, he was missing in action. One of his buddies said, "We saw 2 planes go down. We know one of them was wrecked. The other one we don't know about. So maybe he was in the plane that was wrecked. Maybe he was in the plane that wasn't. But both planes were behind enemy lines. So they really couldn't say what his story was. But when they got the package, they realized that it was going to be a long, long time before they ever saw him again, if they ever saw him again. So they distributed the goodies in there to various guys in his unit. And it was very sad reading the letter from the military back to his wife, because obviously this guy knew him very well. It was not impersonal, as so many of them were.
And imagine what a difficult letter that must have been to write.
It had to be very difficult, and I would like to think that whoever wrote the letter tried to find his family after the war and said, here's how we remember him.
Yeah. Some of the families that you have come in contact with, I assume that there are some cases where you have not been able to find remains, or you've not been able to find...
Many cases where remains were not found. But the ironic thing is that the more difficult it was to find the remains, the better the record keeping is. Because the military wanted to be able to prove that if they couldn't find somebody, they really tried to do it. And many times the next of kin would enlist the aid of their senator or their congressman. And you see some of the letters in these files that are from senators that are very pointed. It's, "You Army, you guys screwed up. My constituent says you can't find their body. You say they're dead, but you can't find the body. What's the story?" So the military wanted to be able to prove that they have moved heaven and earth to try to find these. So in the files would be the report of the search they did, the report of the downed aircraft if the guy was on a plane, an after-action report from the guy's regiment to prove that they were under heavy combat the date that he disappeared. So there's a tremendous amount of information in those cases.
Yeah, and the military command staff, there's nothing that scares them more than to have a senator sending a letter.
You're right, and when you read the letters back, boy, you can tell how scared they are on those letters.
Boy, oh boy. Ensign Dudley Crawford, Jr.
Dudley Crawford, an interesting guy from North Carolina. He really comes across as a nice, solid citizen.
And may I just interject?
Yeah.
He looks like, you know, I grew up looking at Life magazines, Look magazines at the library. He looks like exactly like the impression that I had of the all-American boy.
You know, I think he is an all-American boy. He was from a little town called Rutherfordton, North Carolina, and when he joined the Navy, the mayor of the town wrote a letter. These guys all had to get 3 letters of recommendation. One was from the mayor, and it talked about his family and how nice he was and what an asset to the Navy he would be. What's interesting also is that he had graduated from college in North Carolina, but then came out to UCLA to get an advanced degree. And then the war came along and he went into the Navy, and he was, right after graduation, he was sent to a destroyer called the USS Buck. B-U-C-K? Yeah, no one would really know of it. It's just one destroyer among hundreds. They were on patrol duty off Sicily when a German submarine somehow snuck past all the other anti-submarine ships and torpedoed Ensign Crawford's ship. It went down, I believe. A couple remains were found, but most of the crew all went down into the Mediterranean. None of them were ever found.
As you do some of this research, do you have a sense that at that time in the United States, and I was alive during some of that time, a little kid, but my sense, both through reading and through remembrance, is that there was a degree of fatality. That's not the wrong word.
Fatalism?
Fatalism, there you are.
Yeah, there was. And even in some of the ways that the military wrote their reports, as an example, when a bomber didn't come back, one of the ways they would record it is they would record it with the initials FTR, standing for failed to return. And there was absolutely a sense of fatalism in there. And also when you look at the way that these guys were packed onto the ships, or the way that these 10 or 12 guys were put on these bombers, there was no interest in anything about comfort. It was simply economy and getting these guys to the target, and if you can get them back, good. But they knew that losses were going to be very high. And I've done days where I'd look at March 6, 1944, which was the first daylight raid on Berlin. There were tremendous losses. There were 30 or 40 bombers that didn't come back from that raid, and that's not the biggest day of loss by any means. So fatalism was quite high.
So someone who's watched this program, watched this today, if they want to, what do you need to begin doing research?
Well, in most cases, if they can give me a name, then I can go from there. Now, sometimes the names are a bit more common, so I might say, what was his hometown? And with a name and a hometown, I can almost always find their branch of the military and, like I talked about earlier, their service number. And if I've got that, then I can start digging.
Have you come up with ones that you were not able to come up with anything, find anything?
The only time I got a name that I couldn't find anything on was a name that was the same name as a guy who had died in the Civil War. And I don't know how this happened, but I got the file for this guy who died at Gettysburg. And It turned out that the family was mistaken. He had not died in World War II, but had died in Korea. So there was never a file in the World War II records anyway.
And speaking of that, very briefly, because we're almost out of time for this segment, World War II veterans are dying off.
Right.
There aren't a lot left.
Right.
Does that increase the curiosity of survivors?
Yeah, it does. And it's nice. I talk to these guys all the time. I just talked to a guy that was the classmate of one of the other UCLA guys. We talked 2 weeks ago, and he told me his story. And it was interesting because he said they put him in a weather unit, and he said he regretted not being in combat. He worked at a weather station in Iceland, I think. But one of his buddies had died in Borneo. And so he remembered his friend, and he told me that he called his friend's mother after the war, and that she broke down and didn't want to talk to him. And so he remembered that perfectly, 70 years later.
Yeah. So Churchill, those who wait also serve.
Right.
Yeah.
And boy, these families that had to have a very hard time with their son or their husband serving.
Of course. We've got to take one more break. With your permission and with yours, we'll see you on the other side of about 2 minutes. You can find out more about all the work that Bill Beigel does. You can go to his website, which is a fascinating place to be. It's WW2research.com. And you don't need a www in front of it. It's just WW2research.com. You can contact him by telephone in 310-791-3949, 791-3949, and you'll find links to all of this or additional information at our site, myfoxla.com. I feel like I should salute you for all that you do. You didn't serve in the military yourself.
No, my dad served in the Air Force in the Korean War. I did not.
Well, for all you do, and it's just incredibly important work and something that I think a lot of us don't think about, we thank you for it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
And thanks to all of you. We will see you right back here next Sunday.
In the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you.